Welcome to the session, Patriarchy and the Origins of Women's Oppression. My name is Meredith and I'll be chairing the session. Green Left is the host of this conference, and if you're motivated to become a socialist activist, if you need to join us, let's stay in touch. We acknowledge that we are meeting on the land of the Wurrung language group of the Kulin Nation. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Sue Bull is going to examine the various studies that Marxist feminists have undertaken, looking at how women's equality began and what it means for our creation.
Well, welcome everybody. Just first of all, what I've tried to do with this talk is actually have a bit of a look at the sort of things, the sources that socialist alliances have tended to use, but then some other things along the way, because we haven't written anything substantial on this since 1998. So really I'm hoping that I've just opened up some ideas and that some of you might take it on from there, because there's so much that we can talk about. Okay, well the underlying theme of this conference is a world beyond capitalism. And of course one aspect of that new world will be the liberation of women from oppression, exploitation and discrimination. Now, I'm sure no one here thinks that we can win this liberation as a matter of course. Just because we might have been able to win revolutionary social change doesn't mean that equal economic, social and cultural rights will be automatic for women. Why? Because the origins of our oppression predate the development of class society, and the subordination of women was instrumental in the development of the early forms of class society and the directions they took. Patriarchy, the institutionalised system of male dominance, and paternalism have developed over thousands of years and sadly can't be wished away just because we know that it's wrong and archaic. So to fight against something, we need to know where it comes from, how it developed and how it became so effective. My aim in this talk is not to rewrite Socialist Alliance's analysis of women's oppression, but to refresh our understanding and add some ideas from other writers who we have not always investigated. Hopefully this will get a new layer of women, such as yourselves, looking at how we as Marxist feminists understand and prosecute our case. So, I just want to show you the references that I've used. This one is the one that you'll find online. So this was written by Pat Brewer. It's called The Dispossession of Women, a Marxist examination of new evidence on the origins of women's oppression. And what Pat tried to do over like 25 years ago now was she tried to update the work of other Marxist feminists. And those from the tradition that I come from, we largely used a woman named Evelyn Reed. And she was an American socialist, a feminist, who wrote a lot of quite amazing stuff. And she was a self-taught anthropologist with really, really great stuff. But of course, she's writing in the 70s and 80s, and there's been so much more since then. And Reed was actually updating the work that Engels had done earlier on the family. Now, the second book I used, and this is the first time I've used this is a book from 1985. But this woman's name is Gauda Lerner. Mary will have to correct me on how to say that, but I think that's how you pronounce it. Not good, but Gauda. And she wrote this book called The Creation of Patriarchy, and why she's really significant is because she set up the first feminist history studies in the United States. And for some reason we didn't really study her in any great depth, and I'll explain a bit more later on. But what she's done here is of particular relevance to today's topic, because Lerner exhaustively analysed not only how women may have emerged from prehistoric hunter-gatherer and early farming societies, but also how women's oppression was institutionalised in ancient Mesopotamian societies, followed by the monotheistic, the single god ones, with the development of patriarchy. So that's what I'm going to look at a bit more in the second part of this talk. Well, ever since I joined the socialist movement, which is now 40 years ago, I've always been fascinated by how Marxists approach and study history through historical materialism and dialectics. But it's the application of these concepts to women and our role in history that I find so impressive. You need to remember that Marx and Engels, when they began their studies, it was an utterly misogynist society where capitalism, that time, especially in the early part, a fairly new phenomenon and mode of production, was expanding massively. It was Marx who exposed the role of reproductive labour in capitalism, namely the unpaid work needed to reproduce labour power by creating and raising children, and by feeding, clothing, sheltering and caring for adult workers. And it was Engels who later identified in his groundbreaking book, developed from Marx's notes after his death, The Origins of the Family, Private Property and the State, that said this: the modern individual family is founded on the open or concealed domestic slavery of the wife. And modern society is a mass composed of these individual families as its molecules. Now, Pat shows in her book that a lot of the data that Marx and Engels were using today, it's been well and truly superseded, and some of it was wrong. But what Pat argues for, and indeed I think the other learner would agree with this, a lot of what they were arguing for essentially has been proven as time's gone by, even though their original data was to some extent suspect. And I'll have a quick look at some of these too. But what Marx and Engels did do, and what they were able to do, was beginning nearly 200 years ago now, was pull together all the most radical investigations and analyses of their day, covering history, evolution, philosophy, economics, sociology, anthropology, archaeology, and so much more, and meld these into an astonishing set of tools to understand. And that's the critical thing. Some of the data now, it's suspect, but it's the tools that we as Marxists sort of use in looking at some of these issues. As Peter Boyle says in our Introduction to Marxism pamphlet, Marx and Engels taught that reality should be understood not as a complex of ready-made things, but as a complex of processes in which the things apparently stable go through an uninterrupted change of coming into being and passing away. And that we understand these processes by engaging with reality as well as reflecting on what we perceive. To understand reality, we have to recognise that it is not just the sum of its parts. We need to understand the dynamic relationship between all these parts, and that's the dialectic or the logic of change. So really what they did is they pulled together all this stuff and they said, we make history, but we make it through our interaction with our environment. And our environment isn't just the place, it's the people of the time. And that's an objective thing that can be studied and analysed and looked at. But of course there's a whole lot of subjectivity in there as well, because we're subjective creatures as well. What made their understanding of history so radical at the time was that we're talking about a contrary worldview dominated by the idea that God created everything, human activity was guided by religious beliefs, there was little free will, and most things were predetermined and unchanging. Also, that history was made by great individual men and their ideas. The Marxists turned this on its head and argued that history was made by the interaction of human beings with their environment, under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. That is, that all human beings make history. What each of us does has an impact on the future. And clearly this is so important when we look at the current debates about the impact of capitalism on the environment and the legacy that will be left for generations to come. Well, let's go right back. And this is what we call the long view of history. So let's begin our study with a question. Actually, can you see that? Yeah. Okay, so you can just see how, you all would have seen these things so often, but you can just see how long that human history is, or we think it is at the moment. New discoveries change this overnight, but we think it is. And you can see right down there at 6,000 BP, or we might call it BC, that's when human beings in the modern type world, that's when class society starts to develop. So it's just a blink of an eye. So let's begin with a question. How did women go from thousands and thousands of years of relative equality with men to the subjugation of the last 4,000 to 5,000 years, or maybe it's 6,000, we're not quite sure. Homo sapiens as a species probably began to emerge about 200,000 to 300,000 years ago. But for the purposes of this study, modern humans start to leave Africa about 50,000 to 70,000 years ago, and they spread across the globe. So somewhere around here we begin, and then it's around about here that there's this great movement out. I'll come back to that in a minute. These were small communities of hunter-gatherers, and they were classless. They gathered and hunted food in what were essentially extended family groups, made tools, and developed stories and culture that were handed down from one generation to the next as a repository of acquired human knowledge over thousands of years. They adapted to their changing environments, and everyone in the group had a role to ensure the survival of the group. This much is substantially agreed upon by all historians today. But if you've ever done any historical study before, it's guaranteed that pretty much everybody disagrees on everything in prehistory. New discoveries are made, and wham, the debates in anthropology or archaeology will go off in completely different tangents. For example, it took decades of hotly disputed point scoring and evidence gathering before there was substantial agreement on the out of Africa theory, i.e. that modern humans left Africa to populate the globe. So today the majority of anthropologists would agree, and the various branches, that the modern human, as in Homo sapiens sapiens we're called, actually came out of Africa and then spread everywhere. No agreement on exactly when, and there's still a small group saying, no, that's not what happened. But most now actually agree on that. So with this in mind, let's move to the main controversies about the role of women in these hunter-gatherer communities. I'm going to look mainly at the differences between Marxist and biological determinist theories. So the early hunter-gatherer groups, according to the Marxist perspective, had a division of labour that was based on sexual and age differences. Women's bodies produced children, and if the group was to reproduce itself, then women of childbearing age needed to devote time and protection to the development of their child. This meant breastfeeding and carrying the child around. Human beings, due to our bipedalism, have children that are born in a much more immature state than most other mammals. The dependency on their mother is greater for longer. You probably know this, but once human beings stood upright, the pelvis didn't actually broaden for more well-developed babies to come out of us. So consequently, the babies that come out are very immature, which actually require a lot longer to be looked after. Like, we take a year before we can walk. So there's all that sort of thing. So that independence was problematic, if you like. So the ramifications of this meant that it was likely women really went on the hunt for big game. They certainly did, and there's proof now that there were lots of women that went on the hunt for big game. Was it women of childbearing age? Quite possibly not, but maybe it was. That's not really clear. But the reason why it's quite probable that they spent most of their time around the camp was because they had a child every 3 to 4 years, roughly. And instead, so what they did is they gathered plants and small game closer to the camp. Indeed, many studies show that women gathered at least 60% of the tribe's nutrition. Women may have also done chores like cooking and hut building around the camp, though this could just as easily have done by men, not out hunting, and older members of the group whose hunting days were over. Child rearing of independent children was probably shared by everyone, including the telling of stories to educate and pass on the collective knowledge of the tribe. Of course, many communities developed differently and had different traditions, but it would appear that the trajectory of the development was similar. So you can't leave out the whole concept of diversity, because everyone's developing in a different environment. So of course, it wouldn't have been exactly the same everywhere. But we think the general direction goes this way. So Lerner stresses that what is significant about the development is not that there may have been differences, but that it was not intrinsic to our biology. In other words, it wasn't in our genes. She says, clearly, oh, sorry, I was meant to put the earlier. That's your ad Africa one. Lerner stresses that she says, clearly the link between childbearing and child rearing for women is culturally determined and subject to societal manipulation. My point is to stress that the earliest sexual division of labour by which women chose occupations compatible with their mothering and child-raising activities were functional, hence acceptable to men and women alike. So this is what she's saying, and this is really, as Marxist, what we would tend to agree with, that the development was something that came about because it was a functional way of the tribe surviving. So not because they had to, but because it was just a sensible division of labour. So that's really where we would tend to interact with one of those. She goes on to say that humankind would not have successfully developed if these choices had not been made. They were necessary to our development. Lerner explains that if women did not mother well and the tribe didn't look after mothers and children, the future of the tribe was at risk. She says, groups that accepted and institutionalised a functional division of labour were more likely to survive. So that's sort of the logic of the way we tend to put it. There were other cultural practices that developed over time in many of these early communities that had an impact on our study today too, namely the incest taboos. We first encounter a debate about what these sexual taboos may have led to in these early communities in Engels' Origins of the Family, Private Property in the State pamphlet. Engels' analysis drew heavily from an American anthropologist, and you'll see him here, this is Morgan. And these are some of the ones that have been a bit discredited, but not entirely. So he was coming from there. And Morgan actually had done an extensive study of the Iroquois Native Americans and their kinship and social structures. As Pat Brewer says about Morgan's studies, they show that primitive society exhibited egalitarian social and sexual relations and was characterised by collective production and communal ownership of property. Engels also drew from Morgan's retrospective reconstruction of the history of the family, the social and sexual relations of particular societies as they developed historically. So you've got to try and get your head around this. So we've got archaeology and anthropology, digging stuff up, but the anthropologists also were studying the remains of tribal societies around the world, hunter-gatherer societies around the world. But these hunter-gatherer societies were modern hunter-gatherers. And they too would have developed over time. But there's still some things we can learn from the way they live today. And you can see this in Bruce, in Dark Emu and some of these things. We can still learn some things from what's going on today, even though we have to accept that 60,000 years ago, they would have been relatively different from what they are today. So you've got to sort of keep that in mind. Okay, so according to Brewer's explanation, these communities were basic units composed of a community of mothers, their brothers, and the children of the mothers. The family was traced through the mother's line matrilineally and excluded sexual relations with children and siblings. This led eventually, according to Brewer, to pairing relationships based on mutual agreement in which each partner had the ability to dissolve the bond. So what is often argued is that we probably haven't got a lot of proof of matriarchal societies, but what we have got proof of is matrilineal societies. And that's there in sort of ancient, we can find it sort of mentioned in sort of ancient survivals of ancient written stuff, but we can also find it in the survivals of some of the communities that still have existed in the last 200 years. So we can sort of show that. Lerner goes on to say, what we can really see is that there are matrilineal societies but in the end they become patrilineal. I.e., the descent of people comes down through the male side. What we can't necessarily see is a movement away from patrilineal back to matrilineal. And this is where a whole lot of the debates come about. So is everyone sort of clear? Matrilineal means coming down through the mother's side, patrilineal through the father's side. Matrilocal means living in the mother's area, and patrilocal means living in the father's area. But what we haven't got proof of, they may have existed, is matriarchal, i.e. where women ran everything on their own. The Amazon, we can't prove that yet. Or maybe we never will. So interestingly, most anthropologists today now agree that because of genetic and other evidence, that early human kinship may have been matrilineal. So get your head around this. Mark and Engels go, oh, I think this has shown that this was all matrilineal. And then a whole lot of the more bourgeois commentators go, oh, that's just communist orthodoxy. Today, nearly everyone agrees that these societies were matrilineal. So that's one of the interesting things. Just all the modern evidence is showing that. What we can largely get agreement on now is that this was how human communities existed throughout most of human history. As Brewer says, it's been estimated that more than 90% of people who have ever lived have been gatherers in small groups spread over sparsely populated large areas, able to choose the most favourable environments available. If you think back to that long view, that's how we did for most of the time. Okay. Oh, sorry. Let's just show you this communist orthodoxy. Okay, so, but we do disagree with the biological determinants. Fundamentally, they argue that the difference between men and women are inherent to our makeup. We were born with these cultural differences. Things. That is, our differences are not culturally or environmentally developed, but they're intrinsic, genetic, they're natural. So it's natural for women to be maternal, caring or retiring, weak and in need of protection. It's natural for men to be hunters, strong and aggressive with uncontrollable sexual urges. As Brewer says, women's subordinate role has been justified in terms of their functions, of the functions they have to carry out in giving birth and raising children. Their subordination is seen as based on their biology and thus their destiny. It's natural. So, of course, we've all seen this, but, it's natural for men to be thinkers, to do with their heads, and it's natural for women to be overly emotional and, not really think with their heads, just their hearts. And this is all the stuff that we've all really grown up with. This is how bourgeois society explains the difference between men and women. Okay, well, about 10 to 12,000 years ago, we have what's called the Neolithic. It's the last ice age began to dramatically recede and the Holocene, the current geological period, began. In the Fertile Crescent, now there's some debate about the Fertile Crescent, so I put up the bigger picture, Fertile Crescent. So I put one up here that stretches from Egypt right across, and if you can imagine, just try and get your head around this. This is modern day Turkey. Down here is sort of Palestine and Jordan. Over here is Lebanon and Syria, which goes pretty much up to there. And over here is Iraq, and this part's Iran. So that's really the area that we're looking at. Now, one stream of thought goes that in actual fact the Fertile Crescent only goes this far. But another says, no, it goes this far. We don't need to know all of this, but it's just so that you can get your head around it. So I'll put up the bigger picture. Okay. Pretty much everything that the Western world develops from here. So this all spreads to Europe, and then of course we know the Europeans conquer everywhere else. And so a lot of the culture that we see today, the Western culture, really emanates from here. Okay, so what was happening about 10 to 12,000 years ago is the ice ages are receding, and the warmer but perhaps drier weather led hunter-gatherers to begin farming. and that's called the Neolithic Revolution. The same changes began to happen later in other major river basins, such as the Indus in India and the Yellow River in China. This is known as the Neolithic or the New Stone Age period. So it's not to say that we don't see major developments perhaps about the same time, but we know that those developments, while they are really significant in Asia and America, are not as significant in where we end up with capitalism. It's this area it's most, but it all interrelates, and it's all very important actually, but I'm only going to talk about this area today. So we're concentrating on the Fertile Crescent because this is where the communities developed into the first major civilization, which is called Sumer, or you can see on the map here it's called Mesopotamia. But most of the archaeologists would refer to it as Sumer. And it directly led over millennia to the development of capitalism. It's not that the other communities had no significance or influence. In fact, what is fascinating is that despite their diversity, the trajectory of the developments has so many similarities. But that, of course, is the story for another topic. Now, no one really knows why human beings chose to settle down and start farming, because all the evidence shows that life was actually better when humans followed the seasons hunting and gathering. The diet was definitely more diverse, people were healthier, and the workload was much less. So the survivals of human beings from this very early farming period are quite bizarre. Humans overnight become stunted. They don't live as long for the early period, and they clearly show signs on their bodies of massive overwork. So a lot of people look back at this time and go, what? Why would they have done that? They had these great lives, hunted and whatnot, sat around for hours and hours and hours and told stories, didn't work too hard. Why would you go from that to this? And the sad thing is, we actually don't know. So there's lots of theories, but we really don't know what caused it. Okay, so no one really knows why human beings chose to settle down and start farming. Okay, so farming involves much heavier workloads and incurs more physical ailments than relying on the wild. The work-life balance was nowhere near as good. We do know that hunter-gatherers often supplemented their food with the deliberate sowing of seeds. Bruce Pascoe points out in Dark Emu that there was obviously planting and slashing and burning early on in Australia. While finds from ancient seeds in the Fertile Crescent prove that weeding, removing of pests, transplanting, sowing seeds into alluvial soils must have happened for long periods during the Neolithic. And hunters had lived symbiotically with their prey for thousands of years, as the Marxist anthropologist Neil Faulkner notes in his A Marxist History of the World, where he argues that transitioning from hunting to pastoralism could have been gradual and seamless. But Stephen Midman, a professor of archaeology at the University of Reading, poses this quite dialectical question when he asks why would hunter-gatherers have given up their free and easy lifestyle? And he says this, was it by choice, or was that first sowing of seed a trap, locking people into a seasonal cycle of planting and harvesting from which we have been unable to escape? Midman then comes up with a rather speculative answer about religion being the cause, which doesn't seem very convincing, but of course religion may have played a role in ideologically justifying change. One BBC commentator that I read suggests that hunters followed animals from the drying uplands, because remember the weather was getting hotter, to the river valleys, and in these geographically limited areas, people were forced to farm. And I actually find that one more interesting. It's getting hotter, the animals are beginning to look for more water down in the valleys, the hunters start following, because they're still very ambulant, they still move a lot, and then once they're down there, they go, oh, this is really nice, start sowing a bit of seed, but then the population increases. So then you've got a problem. And then one of them explains it this way. Like, certainly we have to say that there was pressure, we don't know what sort. Probably due to environmental and increasing populations perhaps, where land needed to be used more productively. Whatever the reason, humans have found it impossible to go backwards. As Faulkner says, if farmers were to abandon their work, their community would starve, for there were now too many people simply to live off the wilderness. Humanity was trapped in toil by its own success. So in the early Neolithic, the farming of the Fertile Crescent was dominated by horticulture. And it's likely that this was a female occupation that extended from the women's gathering activities and plant knowledge. So horticulture isn't using big equipment, it's using handheld tools to plant seed and then harvest it. So you don't need a lot of strength, you just need lots of time. And so they think really that, it sounds so fascinating, they think that women probably invented it, that very first farming for whatever reason. So these settlements appear to have maintained matrilineal structures, produced largely for their own needs, and while there may have been some trading, craft specialisation and extensive exchange did not happen until a later date. Sorry, I just put this up because this is sort of one way, just a jokey type thing, of someone on the internet sort of saying, oh yeah, agriculture is a trap. But notice how it's male there. Not female there. So you can still see people can't quite get their head around what it actually means. Okay, so you can see in this picture, and this is an imagined picture of course, but you can see women leading the way with the harvesting and all that sort of thing, and you can see also the pictures of the type of tools that they were using. One thing we do know is that they're harvesting seed, and that grinding thing there's actually skeletons that are left that show people were really doing a lot of this stuff, and it was really having an impact on their bodies. So we know that this was actually happening, and a lot of those people were women, like the skeletons were women, but not solely. So it was definitely still mixed. Okay, well the main difficulty with horticulture of that time was that there was little understanding about fertilisation, crop rotation, terracing or irrigation, so the yields were low. And the land often became infertile, and it was time to look for new plots. Over time, this led to land fights and constant battles with neighbouring tribes, including the theft of women as more labour was needed. So eventually through settlement and farming, it did enable, but it also enabled the accumulation and stockpiling of food and the diversification of skills. So you see the early beginnings of all sorts of things starting to happen. Meaning that some of the tribe could now be supported without taking part in the productive process. Consequently, food productivity was high enough to allow for the development of new craft technologies like weaving and pottery. We know that they were amongst the first, leading to the emergence of petty commodity production and trade exchange. However, change appears to have happened slowly but cumulatively throughout the early part of the Neolithic. DNA studies show that there is little intermarriage or gene sharing until about 6000 BC, when communities began linking to one another, possibly via trade networks, which led to intermarriage, children, and of course new ideas. Well, the plough agriculture begins to change everything. It's not until the introduction of plough agriculture that the pace of change increases, and we see a qualitative leap sometime around 5500 BC. So about 500 years later, but there would have been all this accumulation of change previously. Now a single farmer with an ox team could cultivate 10 times or more land than a hoe farmer. This new technology radically altered the status of women, as it was dominated by men, while it also substantially increased wealth within communities by providing not just a stockpile of food, but a huge surplus. Brewer explains it this way. Early plough agriculture required greater physical strength, involving the use of bigger animals such as cattle. Ploughing was also an isolated activity compared to the horticulture of women, and less easily handled with childminding. The development of the plough removed women from their role in the production of the major source of food. So we don't really know why. Like, was it because men were stronger or bigger, that they could do this, quite possibly, but also we do know that to do this with a child on the hip is incredibly difficult. So once again, it was probably a division of labour that was functional at the time, but then it has huge ramifications later on. Okay, so changes brought by plough agriculture, coupled with trends that had emerged since the earliest forms of farming had begun, led directly to what Engels called the world historic defeat of the female sex. Of course, Engels was dramatising the loss of power and status that women had begun to experience over many, many years during this transition to farming, not a single event. I must admit, years and years ago when I first joined the movement, I read this and I thought, does that mean women were actually disarmed and defeated all at once, like in some huge battle? But it doesn't mean it. Over time, and eventually they end up dead. So let's look at these trends. Firstly, the demand for labour inexorably increased as all forms of farming were far more labour intensive than hunting and gathering. So women of childbearing age were in increasing demand with more children needed to provide labour. This meant women spent far greater periods bearing children. We know women in hunter-gatherer societies had a child once every 3 to 4 years. In the Neolithic, the women were far more frequently pregnant. In fact, it's quite likely they were pregnant every year. So their whole body begins to change, which also increased the chances of maternal mortality, and the need for women became ever greater. This thing increased the likelihood of another trend. Women began to be exchanged with other tribes for their fertility and reproductive capacity, reversing natural local traditions where the husband had moved in and lived with the wife's community. Lerner argues that this would almost probably have been by the women's choice originally, as her family and she would benefit from the peace and prosperity that it would bring. It's also better to be exchanged than stolen, and there were certain exchanges too. Sadly, within the process of exchange lay unintended consequences. Women's reproductive power was being commodified, opening her to exploitation as this increased the overall wealth of the tribe. The patriarchy, living with the husband's community, that developed from this process also accompanied the shift, as Brewer says, to emphasise the importance of paternity and the father in the kinship line, as well as a shift to monogamy in sexual relations. Meanwhile, the daily lives of women changed too. Women found themselves more often around the hearth, and in that sort of hearth there was a myriad of home-based activities. They were grinding the grain to feed the increased population, making textile and clothes and also for trade purposes. They were making receptacles to hold food, cooking and also for trade, all the while dealing with annual pregnancies and child rearing. While men were out in the fields, teaching their sons the intensive farming techniques. Sorry, I'm going to go a little bit over. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. So they'd be teaching farming and herding and training for war, as property needed to be defended from marauders. Also, men started to become the traders of all the secondary products that came from farming, herding and household production like cheese, wool or pottery. So essentially what we're saying is that she's pregnant every year. There's a huge demand for labour, but there's huge maternal mortality as well. And of course, as you know, there's huge mortality of babies and infants. So the pressure is just huge. Produce. So she's at home doing stuff that she can actually do while she's pregnant all the time with a baby. So he starts to do all the farming, fighting and the trading. And of course therein lies the shift that you can see starting to happen. But it's impossible to put dates on this, but as the population's growing and more land's needed, as Brewer says, land became the critical resource and migration was one major way of expanding access to the resource. So conflict increased. More men became fighters, but labour for farming was still needed. And so the capture of slaves became attractive. especially the reproductive capacity of female slaves. As Peter Boyle says, such early forms of slavery may well have been one of the first forms of property, along with land, produce, tools and weapons seized from the defeated groups. Initially, such war booty became the communal property of the victorious group, but the clan system started to break down under the pressure of a family system propelled by husband-headed family units based on the individual labour of men in ploughing and herding. Boyle goes on to say, private property first developed through a gradual privatisation of communal property by an elite that used religion and war as cover and justification. In the process, women like slaves, land and livestock became their private property. It's in this context that inheritance becomes critical. Now men wanted to prove that their children were their own. So monogamy intensified for women and their confinement became a growing requirement. As we know, it didn't intensify for men. With Brewer notes, inheritance led to accumulation of wealth over generations, developing the social hierarchies of class, status and power. It's ironic that while the discovery of farming by women at the beginning of the Neolithic period was such a positive leap forward, by the end of the Neolithic it had changed into a negative outcome for women. Their subordination and powerlessness in the developing class society and all class formations from that time onwards. In other words, once women lost their direct role in agricultural production, they lost their status, power and equality as well. Now it's likely that all of this was developing before and during the first fully formed class society of ancient Sumer at about 5000 BC. And the patriarchy was developing as well. I had to put this up. It says private property, trespassers will be prosecuted, climbing on the pyramid is strictly prohibited. Our modern day privatised world. Okay, well Lerner says this. The sexuality of women, consisting of their sexual and reproductive capacities and services, was commodified even prior to the creation of Western civilisation. She maintains that women were originally exchanged in marriage for the benefit of the families, but later they were conquered or bought in slavery, and they were the first slaves, as men were killed, and that this preceded the formation of class society. Lerner goes on to argue that economic oppression and exploitation are based as much on the commodification of female sexuality and the appropriation of women's labour power and their reproductive power as on the direct acquisition of resources and persons. So here's a slightly different emphasis from the one we've always followed. Our position is usually bound up with the idea that the exploitation of women is inextricably linked with the development of private property and class society. But as you can see, Lerner's theory spelled out how the sexual exploitation of women was one of the motive forces to the change. So this is the difference with what we've normally said. It's all bound up together. And she says, no, exploiting women's reproductive power is actually one of the things that actually brings about that change. So she emphasises, and maybe we've always thought it was sort of like that too, she spells it out, and that's what's interesting about the way that she does it. Now, Lerner is often described as a radical feminist, which was the kind of time we would go, oh, rad fems more, but we don't necessarily anymore. However, the co-director with Lerner of the Women's History program at the University of Wisconsin, Linda Gordon, argues that in Lerner's obituary that she actually mixed the Marxism of her political roots with radical feminism. Gordon says that throughout the 2 volumes of The Origins of Patriarchy, the 2 theoretical strands argue with each other, and that's what produces her analysis. Perhaps Lerner overstates her case, I'm not really sure, but there's no doubt that the exploitation of women and their reproductive power must have played a key role in the revolutionary process of changing the hunter-gatherer mode of production to the slave society mode of production, by eliminating the equal decision-making power that women had in hunter-gatherer society and commodifying their labour and their reproductive capacity. This surely helped clear the way to reducing the power and status of other men who were not able to retain their share of property as it became privatised, thus helping to usher in the early beginnings of class society. But of course, a lot of this is conjecture because there's so much about prehistory that we can't really answer, like why humans even began farming in the first place. Remember, our story so far takes place between when the written word is invented, which was not until 3,300 BC or thereabouts. So we have to draw conclusions from mute objects dug up from the ground, carbon dating and DNA analysis, or other remnants of similar societies, say, surviving thousands of years later, all of which has got its traps and inadequacies. But returning to Brewer, when looking at what happens from this point on, she says the wealthy became powerful by leading to poorer clan families, who in return gave services such as labour or combat duty. The divide between rich and poor widened as the poor became more indebted and had less time to spend producing for their own subsistence. This process is the framework within which people, as well as products, animals, goods and land became objects of value for exchange. Children or women could be given for use as labourers or breeders to pay off obligations incurred by poor families. I think Lerner's greater contribution is this one. Throughout her exhaustive study, she analyses the evidence, the development of patriarchy from Sumer through to Judaism, which is a period of about 2,500 years. Lerner notes that Sumer goes through 3 phases of development. Oh, sorry, I'll just have to click this up because this is where we are today.
Can I read what was behind that?
Oh, sorry, I'll go back. Yes, so keep having you reading on. So she notes that Sumer goes through 3 phases of urban development, all underpinned by irrigation and control of water flows during flood times, especially from the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. So try and get your head around this. 12,000 years ago, farming began. 6,000 years ago, the early beginnings of class society start to emerge in that fertile present area, and in particular where modern-day Iraq is today. Because those rivers are flooding, causing huge productivity, and they work out how to irrigate all of this and share the water around. But the further you were from where the irrigation was, the poorer you were. So this is all the class divide that's happening. Okay. Is it okay if I go up left? Okay. Okay, so that's just a couple of pictures of that, and it just gives you the idea of how it works. So Lerner traces how religion, culture and law redefine the role of women and intensify their subordination. So now we're about 4,000 years ago. She trawls through the evidence to show how laws favoured men. Women could be divorced, punished or sold into slavery for adultery, while men could not. Women were first forced to wear veils, had their movements restricted and became the property of their fathers and husbands. And she says something very interesting. She says female subordination within the family became institutionalised and codified in law. Prostitution becomes established and regulated. With increasing specialisation of work, women are gradually excluded from certain occupations and professions. After the invention of writing and the establishment of formal learning, women are excluded from equal access to such education. The religious underpinning for the archaic state subordinate female deities to chief male gods and feature myths of origin which legitimate male descendancy. In fact, she undertakes a thorough analysis of the book of Genesis in the Bible to show how the first monotheistic religion, Judaism, transformed completely the original female goddess. So, you know, this is the that's this is the so these were seen everywhere throughout that fertile region. And then of course that goes straight also across Europe too. So it goes from this, and these were the the original goddesses of celebrating fertility and the creation of the world, etc. And by the time of Judaism, about 600 BC, it's this. So she gets transformed into he, and he's all seeing and all powerful and white. And white, well, this one white. Don't think he was at the time. And so this one, of course, is where women are seen in a narrow, sexually dependent way. Women, by this time, are seen as weak, evil, sexually deviant and in need of a firm hand. Any wonder then that Lerner concludes the basis for paternalism is an unwritten contract for exchange, economic support and protection given by the male for subordination in all matters, sexual service and unpaid domestic service given by the woman. And she says it's a rational choice though, for women under conditions of public powerlessness and economic dependency to choose strong protectors for themselves and their children. Oh, what a sorry end to our story of struggle. We began with this one. Proud hunter-gatherer women who provide 60% of the tribe's nutrition, with a baby on their hip, equal in every way to the men of their group, to this one. So we end with this one, battered, degraded, enslaved and dishonoured. Yet we all know that this is not the whole truth, because in the last century women have been rediscovering that we have played strong, resilient, creative roles throughout the last 5,000 years. It's just that our story was not seen as worth the telling, or maybe there was a fear that if we knew the truth, we might fight back. Because the real truth is that without us, there would be no humanity, there would be no future. So what is the relevance of all of this today? Well, Pat Brewer says it's not just an interesting historical reconstruction based on the evidence, one story of origin among many. The Marxist explanation of the social development of private property and the oppression of women makes sense of the data, and it refutes the dominant explanation of why social inequality exists and why it can't be changed in the doctrine of natural difference, so why the biological determinants are wrong. So yes, to understand our history and the details of what happened helps us get to grips with what we should do next and why we can't let the conservatives and the misogynists have their way. Capitalism learnt the lessons from the previous class society of slavery and feudalism, and generations of feminists have been unravelling the myths and misrepresentations of those eras and drawing lessons for us today. We know that the biggest enemy of women today is capitalism. It pits the working class against each other along sexist, racist and homophobic lines to stop us from fighting back. All the campaigns that women unite around today, whether for equal pay, pro-choice or gender rights, or against all forms of sexual violence and degradation, matter. They build our consciousness and our unity to fight for a better world. They build understanding our history means that we know that for the better part of human existence, women were not subordinate to men, and that a return to the equality of those days will free all humanity for the changes in the future that we must face united together.
Thank you, Sue.